Conceptualism and Materiality, with its precise focus, range of topics, and international roster of speakers, is a tremendous event for us to help support. So I'm delighted to welcome you to our first major conference of 2019-20. And now I'll turn over to my colleague Sarah.
Thank you, everybody, and I'm going to present the counter-narrative because, in fact, Christian has come to Courtauld and been sponsored over the last 2 years by the Mary Curie Foundation on a very prestigious European scholarship. I was fortunate enough to have one myself when he came to me, and I remember our first meeting in Pennethorns, and actually Christian's application had to be sheltered with a host institution and with a kind of host person. And as my MA was called Global Conceptualism, Christian came to me, and our very complicated application was masterminded brilliantly in conjunction with Alex Bovey. So it's really as a Europeanist, and of course if you look at the conference papers, you'll see there's a wonderful mixture here, a global mixture. It's as a Europeanist and under a European umbrella that Christian came to the Courtauld. So for me it's very moving in present circumstances that you'll probably be our last Mary Curie Fellow for some time, and of course it's really, really important that we underline how we couldn't do our art history here without our European colleagues and friends and the European substance of what we study. I'd also like to say that Christian came as a double whammy with his delightful wife Regine Ehleiter, and the two of them contributed magnificently to our intellectual life over the last 2 years. Christian gave 2 or 3 seminars for my students and also contributed vastly to all our external events as well as our internal events. He was also remarkable and is remarkable for his conviviality, and I'm sure we're going to have a fantastically convivial conference. And of course, you added to the pan-conceptual art interest in terms of our teaching at the Courtauld with Joe Applin, American, Clara Kemp Welsh looking at conceptual art in Eastern Europe and Latin America, Wendy Tao looking at Eastern art in China, the global conceptualism, and also Thomas Percival, who's teaching for me this first term and has actually collaborated with Mary Kelly and Andreas Fraser. So we're a very, very conceptual institute here, and I'm bringing you best wishes from Joseph Kasuth, who'd like to be here, the father who is sometimes here in material form, but here in dematerialized form today, who's inaugurating a Magritte Fest of a Kasuth-Magritte collaboration in Brussels today, but is of course the new voices we want to hear and the secret, as yet new to me, chapters in Christian's book, which we're eagerly waiting to see at the end of the day. Christian, it's great to do the conference after the fellowship, but to do the conference and the book launch and actually fulfill your promise, which you promised in the outline of what you're going to do, is really fabulous. So I'm going to ask for a first round of applause for Christian, and I'm sure there'll be more. Thank you very much. Now I'm going to sit still and learn a lot.
So, thank you very much, dear Sarah and dear David, for these very kind and in fact flattering introductions. I hope you can all hear me all right with the microphone? Okay. So, and especially also to Sarah for having been such a truly wonderful and supportive sponsor during my time here at the Courtauld. So, my name is Christian Berger. I was a Marie Skłodowska-Curie Fellow here at the Courtauld over the past 2 years, and I would also like to welcome you to this conference. Thank you very much for coming. Conceptualism and Materiality, Matters of Art and Politics, celebrates the release of an edited volume of the same title, which has just been published this late summer. And actually, I was hoping... kind of. The book presents new research on conceptualism of the 1960s and 1970s by a group of international scholars. And I'm really delighted to say that all the authors who have contributed to this publication are here and that they will present aspects of their research over the coming 1.5 days. And it's really a great pleasure to welcome you all here. The speakers will take their essays in the book as points of departure in order to explore the vexed relationship between conceptualism and materiality. Their presentations will be followed by short responses from experts in the field who are working at different institutions in London and the UK. And thank you all as well for accepting my invitation to kick off the discussions with your contributions. Further thanks are due to the chairs of the different panels whose expertise in conceptualism and 1960s, 1970s art in general will likewise greatly enrich the conversations we will have. Assembling this group of speakers from North America, Asia and across Europe would not have been possible without the very generous support of the Center for American Art, and I'm most grateful to David Peters Corbett as the director of the center, who has really embraced the idea of this conference from the beginning, and of course also to the Terra Foundation. Moreover, I'm hugely thankful to Alex Bowie, head of research at the Courtauld, not only for the Courtauld Research Forum's substantial additional contribution to the budget, but also, and indeed most of all, for a reliable and consistent support throughout my time at the Courtauld. Moreover, I would like to extend my thanks to the whole team of the research forum, past and present. And as far as this conference is concerned, please allow me to single out Carrie Robinson, Grace Williams, and Ingrid Gouillot for making the event happen on a logistical level, as well as to the event steward, Saskia Dakin-Cherry. And I have to add that, I mean, it's a real luxury to organize a conference and not having to worry about so many things, and it's still happening. It's very different from other conferences that I've organized, and I really appreciate this. I will use the remaining part of this introduction to frame some of the issues at stake when addressing conceptualism's material aspects. And in so doing, I will try to set the scene for the papers that follow. I have divided this in two short parts. The first one is titled Idea, Material, and Dematerialization. In February 1968, when the critics Lucy R. Lippard and John Chandler published their essay, The Dematerialization of Art, in the magazine Art International, they introduced a term that has been shaping debates on conceptual art ever since. In this text, Lippard and Chandler notice a shift away from the artwork as an object crafted by the artist or himself, and instead identify two key tendencies of their time. One towards art as idea, and the other towards art as action. Both are described in terms of a departure from materiality because, I quote, in the first case, matter is denied, as sensation has been converted into concept. In the second case, matter has been transformed into energy and time motion. They assert that this trend, and I quote again, appears to be provoking a profound dematerialization of art, especially of art as object, and if it continues to prevail, it may result in the objects becoming wholly obsolete. Now, Lippard and Chandler did not deliver a consistent framework or a theoretical explanation for what they refer to as the dematerialization of art. And while they indicate the importance of John Cage, Marcel Duchamp, and Dada as precedents, the significant prehistory of the term dematerialization in early 20th century abstraction with examples such as Wassily Kandinsky, Elisitsky, or also actually the Italian sculptor Medardo Rosso receives no mention. You can read a bit more about this in my book chapter. The most consistent thread in Lippard and Chandler's argument is the prioritization of idea over object and thinking over making. This privileging of abstraction over material reality, thinking over making, idea over execution, and intellect over sensuality is rooted in a long-standing tradition in Western metaphysics that leads back to the classical Greek philosophy of Plato and Aristotle, as well as to 17th century rationalist philosophy. A similar implicit or explicit idealism can be traced in especially the early writings of some prominent conceptual artists active in Britain and North America. But importantly, this does not apply to even Anglo-American conceptual art as a whole, and even less so to the wider set of practices in different parts of the world that are often referred to with the umbrella term conceptualism. Not only has virtually not a single artist adopted the term dematerialization for their own practice. In fact, the majority of artists, even from the core group of conceptual artists active in New York and hence Lepard and Chandler's own cultural milieu, have contradicted the assumption that getting away from materials had been a vital concern for them. Because of the short time available, allow me to single out just one example. Robert Barry was one of the 4 artists participating in January 5 to 31, 1969, usually referred to as the January Show, a landmark exhibition by the pioneering exhibition organizer Der Siegelaub. So Barry is in this, you have the caption, so he's on the left in the headshot. At the time, Barry was working with very particular configurations of matter and energy, such as gases, radio waves, and the radiation emitted by small quantities of radioactive isotopes. On this slide, you can see, or in fact maybe not really see, his studio being occupied by radio waves of a specific frequency, as illustrated in the January Show catalogue. Barry expressed his fascination with these waves in an interview at the time, when he said, "A world of things can be done with this incredible material, and it is just letting them do what they are supposed to. You cannot change a carrier or radiation wave. You can only know what it is supposed to do and let it do it. That's enough." Barry's works and statements, as well as similar ones by other artists in Siegelaub's circle, indicate that most of these artists were in fact quite interested in materials and materiality. Simultaneously, they were embracing expanded notions of authorship that could even involve the ascription of agency, or of a certain degree of agency, to the materials they used, such as in this quote. This correlation resonates to some degree with more recent theoretical debates on materials and their potentials. And it also has a clear political dimension with regard to the politics of authorship. Seen in the light of what I just described, it seems surprising, if not almost irritating, that Barry's work has frequently served as a model of a so-called dematerialized conceptual art. In his important study of New York conceptual art and the group around Siegelaub, Alexander Albaro chose in fact the headline Dematerialization for the chapter on Robert Barry. Even more problematically, several highly influential accounts of conceptual art have embraced a very limited view of the movement as primarily occupied with concerns of language and analytic philosophy. Benjamin Buchloh, for example, wrote that, I quote, "The proposal inherent in conceptual art was to replace the object of spatial and perceptual experience by linguistic definition alone, the work as analytic proposition." While this might be an apt description of a specific strand within conceptual art, primarily the work of Joseph Kosuth, who has been mentioned, and also the group art and language, it does certainly not cover the wider range of practices associated with the term. Moreover, characterizations such as Buchloh's fail to capture the important changes in artists' and critics' attitudes towards notions of art's material dimension. However, acknowledging these transformations and the critical processes that enabled them seems vital for an adequate understanding of conceptual art and conceptualism. And this leads me to my second point, the politics of art as information. Having received a lot of criticism immediately after publication of the Dematerialization article, Lucy Lepard insisted on using the term in the title of the landmark anthology she published in 1973, 6 years, The Dematerialization of the Art Object from 1966 to 1972, etc. In the preface to that volume, she reconfigured dematerialization as a communicative tool and as a catalyst of the decentralization of the art world, or in her own words, the way of, I quote, getting the power structure out of New York. The curator, Kynaston McShine, expressed similar hopes in his introductory essay to Information, the exhibition he organized at MoMA in 1970. The catalogue of this show explicitly invoked the contemporary political contexts. Photographs of political protests figured prominently in the catalogue's end papers and an extensive appendix of images. The front end paper that you see here shows a news agency photograph of Martin Luther King Jr.'s march on Washington, D.C. in 1963. The notion of artist information is also noteworthy with respect to other accounts of art's reconfigured material dimension and objectual character elsewhere around the globe. Thus far, I've discussed dematerialization and the issues it raises mainly within the context of North American conceptual art. And I've selectively highlighted some of the issues addressed by mostly New York-based artists and critics. Yet similar discussions took place in other parts of the world within the same broad time span, sometimes even using a similar terminology, and they were frequently guided by very different considerations. Despite these important distinctions, however, there were manifold direct connections as well as sometimes surprising parallels between those practices. An important case in point here is the art theorist and psychoanalyst Oscar Mazzotta's roughly concurrent introduction of the term dematerialization in Argentina in a lecture from 1967 and a later essay titled Después del Pop, Nosotros Desmaterializamos, or After Pop, We Dematerialize. And this is the cover of the book where the text has been published, or was published. The possible connections between Lepard and Mazzotta's respective usages of the term dematerialization have been the subject of some debate. This discussion even reached a point where Lepard's integrity has been called into question, as if he had kind of pilfered the term from Mazzotta, and I think there's no real proof for that. But in the end, the almost simultaneous occurrence of similar considerations on a transnational level, and even crystallized in a similar terminology, is far more interesting than any reiteration of problematic categories like priority or influence. In his text, Mazzotta highlighted the new opportunities of communication that would be afforded by works that take the forms and strategies of the mass media as their model. And he finally argued for the dissolution of art in the mass media and in society. His vision was more radical than Lepard's, but not entirely different in its thrust. This transformation from art as idea to art as information or communication is significant because it encapsulates what the art historian Blake Stimson has referred to as the promise of conceptual art, or in other words, its historic and ongoing potential. While conceptual art's, in many ways inconsistent and incomplete, attempts towards a reconsideration of the object character of art did not result in a fundamental transformation of art's commodity status, they did challenge capitalist systems of exchange through their critique of objecthood. More importantly, perhaps, conceptualist practices recalibrated the symbolic value of art according to its communicative and socio-political potential. They envisioned and developed key strategies that have enabled the establishment of new connections between art and the world at large. And as I've tried to exemplify, issues of materiality have indeed played a key role in these attempts, and therefore it seems productive to address the relation of conceptualism and materiality as a matter of art and politics. And on this note, I would like to close my introduction and slowly start to transition to the first panel. So allow me therefore to just very briefly introduce the chair of that panel, Joe Applin. Joe Applin is currently head of the History of Art department at the Courtauld, which he joined in 2016 after 11 years teaching at the University of York. She's a specialist in modern and contemporary art, with a particular emphasis on American art since 1960. Allow me to single out among Joe's very numerous publications only 3 titles that seem particularly relevant for the topic of our conference, namely her recent monograph, Lilosano, Not Working, published with Yale University Press in 2018. Another monograph, also with Yale, Eccentric Objects, Rethinking Sculpture in 1960s America, 2012. And finally, London Art Worlds, Mobile, Contingent, and Ephemeral Networks, 1960 to 1980, co-edited with Catherine Spencer and Amy Tobin, and published with Penn State University Press, I think, in 2018. So, Joe, the stage is yours.
Thanks, Christian. It's lovely to be here. Okay, I'm just going to dive straight in by introducing our speakers one at a time, and then they're each going to come and give their paper. Our first speaker is Kavior Moon, an art historian and critic who teaches at the Southern California Institute of Architecture, where she's a liberal arts faculty member. She received a BA in Visual Arts from Columbia University and an MA and PhD in Art History from the University of California, Los Angeles, where she wrote her dissertation on the later works of Michael Asher and the expanded field of contemporary art institutions. Her scholarly work focuses on modern and contemporary art history, with a particular emphasis on institutional critique and experimental post-studio practices after 1960. In addition, Moon has taught at UCLA and the Art Center College of Design in Pasadena. Her essays and reviews have appeared in such publications as Art Forum, Kaleidoscope, and Extra Contemporary Art Quarterly. She's a founding board member of Equitable Vitrines, a non-profit public art organization based in LA, and her title this afternoon is Itinerant Matter, Michael Asher's Airworks.
Hello, everybody. Good evening. Thank you, Joe, for that introduction. And thank you, Christian, and to the Courtauld for organizing this event. I first met Christian a few years ago when he was a postdoctoral researcher at the Getty Research Institute. And the very first version of what became the book chapter was a paper that Christian invited me to write to give at the symposium. And it's just really nice to see how all the conversations and the papers that were given then have materialized into this publication that's coming out very, very soon. All right, so yes, exactly. The title of my paper is called Itinerant Matter, Michael Asher's Airworks. So I'm going to be talking about some very early airworks by the Los Angeles-based artist Michael Asher. Nearly all of the site-specific artworks by the artist Michael Asher were impermanent. Throughout his career, Asher produced artworks that were not object-based, but rather took the form of site-specific installations, in which pre-existing elements drawn from a site were temporarily removed or rearranged to make viewers cognizant of the physical structures surrounding them and how they operated within their institutional context. Since the late 1960s, he had refused to make works intended to exist independently of a particular exhibition context that could be readily sold and traded on the art market. To curtail the objectification of his works, he did not title them. Asher named his artistic method situational aesthetics, emphasizing that he was, quote, the author of the situation, not of the artwork's elements, end quote. His temporary alterations would prompt viewers to analyze the work's site through its architecture and how it functioned within larger economic and social systems, shifting one's attention from work to frame, to quote the title of art historian Craig Owen's landmark 1985 essay. For this reason, Asher is considered one of the founding figures of institutional critique, an approach to producing artwork that reveals how an institution's often overlooked structures actively shape how meaning is produced. His 1974 installation at the Claire Copley Gallery in Los Angeles clearly exemplifies his institutional critical approach. For this work, he removed a wall dividing the viewing area from the back office and storage area in order to frame, conceptually and literally, the gallery as a place of social, cultural, and economic exchange. So you'll notice that a lot of my slides, it can be a little bit difficult to decipher what exactly the work is from. There are sort of remaining documents that exist, but for a lot of his works, which don't exist anymore, I will be representing them through often an axonometric drawing or a floor plan on one side and then installation photographs on the other. To date, Asher's site-specific works have largely been discussed in terms of an expanded approach to sculpture, one that uses architecture to deconstruct and undo its terms. From this perspective, Asher's 1969 installation at the San Francisco Art Institute is viewed as a foundational work, one that set the parameters for Asher's site-specific practice. To produce his installation, Asher had freestanding wall panels that belonged to the school lined side by side, taped together, and then painted over to produce one long continuous wall. Here's a drawing that the curator at the time at the San Francisco Art Institute drew and then mailed to Asher, so you can get a sense of the modular wall panel as a sort of object in and of itself, which is what Asher used to create his long continuous wall. This newly composed wall was abutted against an existing structural wall so that it would stand in the middle of the gallery's large room and divide it into two distinct areas. In this work, the repeating wall panel units, typically used as a support structure to display works of art, became the artwork itself. Art historian Benjamin Buchloh has argued that with this pivotal work, Asher engaged the terms of minimal art, while also enacting a critique of its latent formalism, and in doing so, quote, defined a new understanding of sculptural materiality, end quote, one in which materials are not simply materials, but procedurally and contextually determined. Reinforcing the sense that Asher's site-specific practice began with this work at the San Francisco Art Institute is the fact that this artwork is the first to appear in his book, Writings, 1973 to 1893, on works, Writings, 1973 to 1983, on works 1969 to 1979, a chronological account of Asher's works produced by the artist in close collaboration with Buchloh. A compilation of project statements, architectural plans, and photo documentation, Writings has been instrumental in disseminating information about Asher's works from 69 to 79, and in shaping the current understanding of his practice, particularly since, with few exceptions, his works no longer exist in material form. In an article by Peter Plagans, published in Artform in 1972, however, Asher mentions that, in the artist's word, his jumping-off point for his site-specific practice happened earlier, during the years 1967 to 69, one that resulted in a series of air works. So this was a question that began the paper that I initially gave at the Getty. How might these early air works have served as a jumping-off point for Asher's subsequent work, whose practice Buchloh has characterized as, quote, among the most concrete and materialist aesthetic productions of the 60s and 70s, end quote. So my book chapter tracks Asher's use of air as artistic material, from his early experiments around 1966 to 1967 to his exhibited air works in 1969 and his 1970 installation at Pomona College. Between the 12 months of April 1969 and March 1970, Asher produced 7 artworks in steady succession. What had not been analyzed is how these artworks all relate to one another and how the development of these early works show the artist pursuing a close study of materials, beginning with air. The progression of his decision shows how crucial material considerations were to the advancement of his ideas. Asher's exploration of air led him to work with architecture, at first as a means to hold and conceal his air-blowing equipment, and then as a medium to shape the movement of air, light, sound, and bodies in space. I argue that this early material investigation of air in architecture set the groundwork for what would later develop into a materialist practice by the mid-1970s. And in this presentation, I will show how materially based Asher's use of air was by comparing his work with those of other conceptual artists using air around the 1960s. Asher's approach to air was rooted in exploring its material qualities, ones that could be physically sensed and understood through basic aerodynamic principles. During the summer of 1967, Asher carried out his experiments with air in a step-by-step process, observing the physical effects of one change and then trying another. He began by opening a window and sitting beside it to feel the breeze. Then he opened various combinations of windows in his apartment. He also learned about air movement from a scientific point of view. Flows of air condensed and accelerated in accordance to the Venturi effect, he observed, in which constrictions in space counterintuitively cause air currents to quicken while pressure decreases. He then moved his experiments into his garage in order to try out different types of air blowers, which he attached to ducting to produce columns and planes of air in different configurations. A comparison of two images conveys how Ascher's move to working with air shifted the terms of an artwork's form for him and how it could be received by a viewer. In the first image, the one on the left, we see a photograph of a work with no title from 1967 that directly preceded his earliest air work, an 18-inch square sheet of glass suspended in a brushed aluminum frame. The glass pane is clear, revealing, in the same shape and size, the surface area of the particular wall on which the work hangs. Instead of functioning metaphorically as an open window onto a window imagined by the artist, an image into which the viewer could project him or herself into paintings, an image into which the viewer could project him or herself as in paintings historically, in Ascher's work there is no illusion of an Albertine window or picture plane. The frame piece of glass creates a shallow pocket of air between the transparent pane and the wall behind it. The framed object demarcates a literal volume of real space, but one into which only one's eyes are able to enter and optically traverse. In the image on the right, we see one of Ascher's drawings for an early air work, a piece of documentation that represents an idea for a work that no longer exists. The walls of the enclosed room have become the work's frame, so to speak, what delimits it from the material and social reality beyond the white cube space of the garage studio. It is a space that can be entered into and explored with one's entire body, not just a pair of eyes. Unlike the object form of his earlier framed glass work, this air work would have been invisible and dynamic, composed of a set of pressured air currents cutting through the space of the room, as indicated by dotted lines in the drawing. The artwork's form has become ephemeral and spatio-temporal. Its presence could only be confirmed through the somatic experience and embodied reception by a visitor. Ascher's airworks took on a new layer of complication when produced for specific exhibitions. The first two airworks exhibited by Ascher were shown at nearly the same time, in 1969. He contributed an airwork to The Appearing Disappearing Image Object, one of the first exhibitions of conceptual art held on the West Coast. He also contributed an airwork to Anti-Illusion, Procedures Materials, an exhibition held at the Whitney Museum in New York City. Each airwork was modified to fit each exhibition situation. At the Newport Harbor Art Museum, an air blower unit was installed just inside and above the museum's main entrance. The speed and pressure of its airflow made the work's presence noticeable. One art critic described the event as physically refreshing to stand under. In contrast, at the Whitney exhibition, the air blower was hidden above a doorway between two rooms on the museum's fourth floor. This plane of air stopped 3 feet short of one of the doorway's sides so that the visitors could walk through it or bypass it or even miss it altogether. The air curtain for this exhibition ran at a significantly low speed so that it would be barely perceptible. Ascher purposefully reduced the work's airflow to emphasize its, quote, conceptual dimension, end quote. This would provide, he felt, greater contrast with expressively solid sculptural pieces, such as Richard Serra's 1-ton prop. So here is an early version of the annotated floor plan for Anti-Illusion, Procedures and Materials. And here are some installation views of the final exhibition that was open to the public. There were no installation photos taken of Ascher's airwork for the installation, but you can get a sense of where it was located. If you look at the photograph on the right, it was located invisibly in that doorway, right next to Eva Hesse's expanded expansion, which in turn was was on the wall that was in the back of Richard Serra's castings and the 1-ton prop, which you can see on the right side. After exhibiting 2 airworks, the ones I just talked about, Ascher worked on a series of 4 room-based installations. At first, these room installations might seem unrelated to the airworks, but architecture was a key consideration and component of Ascher's airworks. Constructing panels was part of the process of figuring out the structure of the airworks in his garage. The exhibited airworks required other considerations, such as where to suspend the air blower units, as well as how to integrate them as invisibly as possible into the existing architecture. So in the book chapter, I go through more in detail the process of decision-making that Asher went through as he produced these room-based installations one by one, directly after one another. Asher first used walls directly as material in installation at the San Francisco Art Institute in April of 1969. So this is the key work for Benjamin Buchla, which I mentioned earlier. In the fall of that year, Asher used walls again to create room-like spaces for 3 other exhibitions. Lucy Lepard's Number exhibition that was held at the Seattle Art Museum Pavilion, a solo exhibition that Asher had at the La Jolla Museum of Art, and at Spaces, a group exhibition that was curated by Jennifer Licht at MoCA. At Spaces, a group exhibition that was curated by Jennifer Licht at MoMA in New York. These room-based installations would prepare the ground, so to speak, for Asher's now canonical 1970 installation at the Gladys K. Montgomery Center at Pomona College. So these are more floor plans and installation photos of Asher's solo exhibition at La Jolla Museum of Art, and then his installation at Spaces, which was held at MoMA around the same time. For his work at the Gladys K. Montgomery Art Center at Pomona College, Asher had 3 walls constructed, one in the exhibition room and 2 walls that joined in the lobby. The newly constructed walls with the existing walls together created 2 intersecting triangles, one small and one large, connected by a narrow passageway. The ceiling was lowered to 6 feet 10 inches. All surfaces were painted white, and the 2 glass doors of the Art Center's main entryway were removed. So here are some installation photos in which you can kind of get a sense of what it would feel like to enter into the space. So here's the entrance from when you're standing outside. The passageway that adjoins the 2 triangular areas that he created by adding constructed walls to the existing walls of the Art Center. Installation view of the 2 separate triangular spaces within the Art Center, and the view upon leaving the Art Center. Asher saw this project as connected to his earlier airworks, as well as his installation for Spaces at MoMA, which directly preceded this work. He stated, quote, "I originally intended the installation at Pomona College to deal with air movement generated from natural outdoor sources rather than mechanical means, and to direct that air movement through the gallery. In this regard, the installation was an amplification and variation on my early airworks. The Pomona work was similar to the installation at the Museum of Modern Art in that it collected and structured given exterior elements and integrated them into the work. Air for Asher was material with specific physical properties. To see the air currents in the installation, as he worked on it, Asher would use a smoker gun of the type used by professionals to check for drafts in a room. Los Angeles-based sculptor Maury Baden, who was then professor and chair of the art department at Pomona, and who assisted with Asher on this installation, recounts seeing Asher fire the little pistol in the larger room. This is Baden's account of Asher testing the air currents with the little pistol gun. He said, he has said in an interview, "This gob of smoke took off, went along the wall at chest height where we were standing, turned the corner, went along the opposite wall in front of us and into the first room, went around the 2 walls there, and then went out the door. And then Michael said, 'It's working.'" End quote. In his installation at MoMA, Asher had tried to balance 3 fields of perception: audio, tactile, and visual. In his installation at MoMA, Asher had tried to balance 3 fields of perception: audio, tactile, and visual. And so in my book chapter I talk about, I provide evidence for that claim. In his installation at Pomona, Asher realized that trying to control the effects of a single element would be impossible. He explained, quote, "All of the various elements, once the space had been literally open to them, had to become inherent determinants in the production and reception of the work. The arbitrary way in which the exterior elements enter the triangular spaces was as important to the work as the material construction of the installation, if only as a contradiction of the installation's formal control over those elements," end quote. By creating an open-ended installation, one that physically and conceptually merged with the outdoors, Asher figured out how to organize light, air, and sound to amplify the viewer's experience of the space without adding specialized machines or materials. The installation at Pomona, however, also opened up a new dimension for Asher. Asher mentioned that it was during a visit to the space at night that he realized how the operating hours of art institutions control the public's access to culture. The significance of removing the center's front doors did not occur to him until later, after he had followed his materially based methodology to a logical endpoint. By removing the gallery's front doors to allow an outside air and day and night, Asher's installation at Pomona College inadvertently opened up an explicitly social dimension and a new set of conceptual problems to consider, ones that he would use to develop a materialist critique and situational aesthetic approach in the following years. The strategy of removal would characterize a subsequent phase of investigations in which installations would begin to function as deliberate critical interventions, such as Asher's exhibition at the Clare Copy Gallery in 1974. So now I'm just going to contextualize Asher's use of air a little bit. Asher wasn't alone in his interest in using air as material around the mid-20th century. As architectural historian Laurent Stadler has pointed out, a number of architects pursued an architecture of air during the post-war period. Among the numerous examples he points out are Allison and Peter Smithson's concept for air doors and air dryers in their House of the Future project in 1956, Buckminster Fuller's 1960 proposal of a 2-mile dome spanning Midtown Manhattan, and various inflatable structures designed by Warren Chalk, Hans Hollein, among others. But perhaps the most focused undertaking of air architecture from around this time was Yves Klein's project for an architecture de l'air, for which he collaborated with the German architect Werner Runau in 1958, and then with the French architect Claude Perron, beginning later that year until Klein's untimely death 5 years later. This project consisted of designs for furniture pieces, architectural structures such as roofs and walls, that would all be made from pressured planes of air. Klein also imagined vast envelopes of air that would cover entire cities and protect their inhabitants from adverse weather conditions, which is similar to what Buckminster Fuller was envisioning for his dome over Midtown Manhattan. What Klein ultimately sought with his air architecture was a utopic return to Eden. So this is a quote from an essay by Klein. "We will no longer be able to hide anything in this type of air architecture. It is indeed an important step, which has been taken on the path leading back to the Garden of Eden, where we will live once again with one another without being ashamed." End quote. For all his utopian claims, Klein was also quite pragmatic. In the late 1950s, he began to patent his designs for the air architectural works he designed with Runau and then later with Perron. Whereas Klein sought to protect his ideas and stake ownership over his designs for air architecture, which at least theoretically could be reproduced upon demand, Asher's air works were singular in form, not just in concept. They also emerged slightly later in a different historical and discursive context. Asher's air works can be seen as in dialogue with works by other conceptual artists who had tried to undermine or circumvent the object-based conventions of retinal art making. Art historian Alexander Albero has rightly characterized 1960s conceptualism as, quote, a contested field of multiple and opposing practices, end quote. One could argue, however, that many of conceptual art's central protagonists shared a common motivation: to separate a work's concept, said to be its artistic contribution, from its form of presentation, which was often viewed as arbitrary or negligible. An instructive comparison to Asher's air work is a conceptual art group, Art and Language's The Air Conditioning Show, an artwork based on the idea for an exhibition in which the flow of air generated by a gallery's air conditioning unit is nominated as a work of art. Conceived in 1966 by Art and Language co-founder Michael Baldwin, this exhibition concept was first presented in the text called Remarks on Air Conditioning, an Extravaganza of Blandness, published in the November 1967 issue of Arts magazine, which was right around the same time that Asher was experimenting with air in his garage studio. Baldwin and his Art and Language colleague Terry Atkinson then reworked remarks on air conditioning into an expanded essay called Frameworks, which was printed independently and distributed the following year. In Frameworks, Baldwin and Atkinson proposed that the room ought to be, quote, as bland as possible in its every feature, visually non-juicy, and that its temperature ought to have a take-it-for-granted quality. The air conditioning show challenges the prioritization of the phenomenological experience of an artwork over its linguistic description or its understanding as a linguistic proposition. The air conditioning show as an artwork can but does not have to be realized for the artwork to exist. In Lawrence Weiner-like fashion, the piece need not be built, and the work can simply exist as a written proposition that communicates a concept for an exhibition. So the air conditioning show was realized in a couple of instances, including in 1972, where it was organized by Joseph Kossuth at the School of Visual Arts in New York City. In contrast to Art and Language's air conditioning show, as well as works by other conceptual artists that I talk about in my book chapter, Asher intended his work's concept, material presentation, and the viewer's experience of this material presentation to be inseparable from one another. Hence the general rule for Asher that once an installation of his work was taken down, that work could no longer exist. Although the idea that drove Asher to experiment with air, to, quote, to avoid specific formally ordered art object materiality, end quote. Although this idea could be seen as sympathetic with the anti-formalist approach towards so-called dematerialized conceptual art, in the actual execution of his exhibited works, Asher was meticulous in his attention to detail and specifications as to what materials were to be used, where they would be positioned, and how the entire installation would be perceived by viewers. This level of deliberation and precision was apparent even in Asher's air works, whose physical forms one couldn't have seen, only momentarily felt. And so as a little conclusion, how can we talk about the materiality of Asher's air works? What kind of material is air? In her book, The Forgetting of Air in Martin Heidegger, the psychoanalyst and theorist Luce Irigaray offers a philosophical meditation on the peculiar qualities of air. Irigaray begins her account with a critique of Heidegger's focus on earth, Erde, as that from which all things emerge. She points out that Heidegger overlooked air as a precondition for his notion of the clearing, what he called Lichtung, which for him represents the space of unconcealment, or when things reveal themselves as they are. Instead of privileging the ground, Irigaray seeks to speak about air, what she calls, quote, this unthinkable that exceeds all declaration, all saying, or posing, phenomenon or form, while remaining the condition of possibility, the resource, the groundless ground, end quote. Following Irigaray, air as a substance is deeply paradoxical. In her book, she meditates, place of all presence and absence, no presence without air. But since air never takes place in the mode of an entry into presence, perhaps except in wind, the philosopher can think that there is nothing but absence there, for in air he does not come up against a being or a thing. We can interpret Asher's airworks as that wind of which Irigaray speaks, an entry into presence. Asher's airworks compel us to think about the itinerancy of matter as itinerant, or as Deleuze and Guattari have put it, quote, matter in movement, in flux, matter flow that can only be followed, end quote. Following air, I argue, led Asher to architecture as well as to thinking about his artwork through the form of a situation, a temporary structuring of presence, its phenomenological reception by a receiver, who in turn is prodded into perceiving the work's surrounding context, that is, all of the material conditions needed to produce it. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much. I'm going to now introduce our first respondent of the conference, which is Luke Skrebowski. He is lecturer in contemporary art at the University of Manchester and co-author with John Jacob of Trevor Paglen, Sights Unseen 2018, and co-editor of Aesthetics and Contemporary Art from Sternberg Press in 2011. His work has appeared in journals including Art History, Art Margins, Grey Room, Manifesta Journal, Tate Papers and Third Text, and he's written catalogue essays for the Tate's Conceptual Art in Britain 64-79 show in 2016 and the Generali Foundation's 25-year anniversary show Amazing Clever Linguistic, an Adventure in Conceptual Arts. He's currently completing a book entitled Contesting Conceptual Art, Aesthetics, Anti-Aesthetics, Politics. Luke co-curated the exhibitions Plastic Words in 2014 at Raven Row and Counter-Production 2012 at the Generali Foundation. His current research explores two areas: the exhaustion of institutional critique and the ecological turn by contemporary artists, and the relationship between art and literature after conceptual art, particularly between post-conceptual art and the novel. Luke.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks to Christian and the Courtauld for the invitation, Joe for the introduction, and to Kavior and Jacob for their rich papers. In my brief response this evening, I'm going to draw out some of the principal threads in our panelists' respective arguments, occasionally also referring back to their originating essays in the Conceptualism and Materiality volume, and offer some comments on these claims, leading us into the panel discussion. I hope my voice is going to hold out as well. I'm suffering with this cold that everyone in London seems to have. So Kavior's paper offered a meticulous reconstruction of the earliest phase of Michael Asher's practice. This phase comprised his experiments using air as an artistic material, undertaken between 67 and 69, and culminated in what Kavior termed Asher's air works, which explored directed airflow within specific architectural sites, the specificity obviously being highly significant in that ensemble. She showed how the artist's understanding and use of air as a tactile material led Asher to engage with other sensory modalities in his work, particularly auditory ones, and in so doing to participate distinctively in the wider, we could say, generational rejection of the prioritization of sight and the optical within formalist modernism. Here, her reading of Asher's work distinguished it from the phenomenologically focused investments of both East Coast minimalists and West Coast light and space artists, as well as, crucially, from the approach of early conceptual art with its speculative extension of the nominative logic of the ready-made to less and less materially substantial objects, including air and other gaseous substances. So think the air conditioning show, early art and language, think Barry, and kind of argon. Most strikingly, Kavior argued that Asher's critique of institutions emerged organically and indeed epiphenomenally from his air works, specifically from his concern to direct natural airflow within a particular architectural site, beginning with his widely discussed Pomona College installation of 1970, which of course has conventionally been historicized as a kind of exemplary early instance of the artistic critique of institution. So really emphasizing kind of different genealogy. So Kavior's framing of Asher's early practice as airworks is, I think, highly suggestive. While she borrows, as I understand it, this critical term from Peter Plagen's art forum criticism of the early 70s, Kavior invests it more fully, and her work suggests the possible critical force of this category beyond Plagen's original usage. I'm interested to hear more about how this category might be developed. How is it constituted? Which other artists' work, in addition to Asher's, could persuasively be ascribed to it? Here I think about another artist conventionally considered to be a prime mover in institutional critique, namely Hans Haacke, who I work on, and his early work using directed airflow, such as Floating Sphere from 64 or Wide White Flow from 67. Now, I think careful work would need to be done here, really teasing out the distinction between air work and practices that were essentially extending kinetic art. I think Haacke's work is quite interestingly positioned in that dynamic, the sort of struggle over reading his affinity with the zero group versus kind of assimilation to a New York post-minimalist milieu. he might be kind of symptomatic in that regard. Nevertheless, I think there are compelling grounds for seeking to explore airwork as a reciprocal critical term to earthwork within the range of practices opened up within the post-medium specific expanded field. So, what can we do with this category of airwork that Kavior recovers and extends? And I think Kavior begins to broach this issue in her suggestive conclusion to the talk, more fully fleshed out in the article. She does so by way of a citation of Irigary's critique of Heidegger's philosophical work. For Irigaray, Heidegger's focus on the notion of earth as the metaphysical ground from which all things emerge is misguided. Here, as Kavior argued, Irigaray pointed out that Heidegger overlooked the role of air as a precondition for the possibility for all enunciation, while itself exceeding all saying. Air, on her account, functions as a form of groundless ground, we could say, philosophically. Speculatively, then, might it be possible to develop just such an Irigarayan reading of air work, seeing in it a refutation of high minimalism's foundational investment in existential phenomenology, principally, of course, that of Merleau-Ponty? How might a more fully elaborated account of air work change the way in which we narrate the putative transition from post-minimalism to conceptualism to institutional critique? This very familiar sequence that perhaps pressure is rightly beginning to be put on, within which, of course, Asher's work remains absolutely central. So I'm now going to turn to Jacob's paper, which offered a dense and nuanced account of the specific ways in which conceptual art affected its linguistification of art against the oculocentrism of formalist modernism. Throughout his paper, Jacob offered a critique of the way in which analytic conceptual art, in its early phase, attempted a process of purification, which rendered art as language, but which separated this language from particular contexts of use. He then contrasted this position with a succeeding moment wherein oral communication and natural talk were folded into the interrogation, focalizing this development through the particular example of Ian Wilson's practice, but also acknowledging art and language's role therein. Jacob concluded by arguing that artists' recognition of the social situatedness of language acts offered a powerful way to map the shift from conceptual art to a more capacious and politically engaged conceptualism, this is developed more in the article, crucially within the Anglo-American context. And so bringing this notion of conceptualism into precise dialogue with how we think about the evolution of analytic conceptual art. So I'm going to focus my remarks here on the final phase of this trajectory that Jacob mapped. While I'm highly sympathetic to the project to recover the force of artistic positions that were historically marginalized, it also seems imperative not to risk any overly schematic refutation of what we might call the residually hegemonic one. In his Historicizeation, I feel Joseph Kosuth hovering above our proceedings somewhere, as Sarah suggested. So in his Historicizeation of art and languages practice, Charles Harrison, of course, long insisted that it was precisely the conversation and its critical and self-critical apparatus that should be understood as the ground of the group's practice, as well as the means by which they sought to locate a broader constituency. Double function of the conversation. In this sense, the suppression of the beholder was to have involved a birth of the interlocutor. Now, the fact that no constituency much beyond the extended group itself could be found or developed was held by its own members to account for the failure of the practice, at least as much as the devolution of analytic conceptual art into an anti-aesthetic aesthetic of an administration. So while it is clear from Jacob's paper that Ian Wilson's attempts to create the conditions of an ongoing discussion of art as art failed even within the context of the art world, it is not clear to me that the conceptualism of a Lozano dialogue piece, say, a work Jacob discusses in his essay in the volume in dialogue with Joe's significant work on Lozano. It's not clear that this succeeds any more fully in this regard, notwithstanding its greater attention to the social meanings inherent in language and its refusal of art mag jargon in favour of more vernacular registers. If conceptualist artists learn to speak more effectively, sort of ventriloquizing Jacob's terms, that would mean to employ a socio-linguistic register with greater range, weren't they also left with the same problem of an absent, or at the very least radically insufficient, constituency? In this respect, it is significant, I think, that in dialogue piece, Lozano caveats her injunction to, quote, call, write, or speak to people with a footnote. And the footnote says, the definition of people remains open. Open here, I suggest, signifies that the work's imagined constituency was at least as much indeterminate as it was to be determined. I think it'd be wrong to read that as a kind of utopian openness in the constitution of that imagined constituency. And I would go further and say that this kind of political deficit already seems to be latently acknowledged by Lozano's sardonic follow-up comment that, this is in the footnote, perfect strangers, an animal, an infant will be included. Right? This kind of a Borgesian categorization of random constituents. I'm going to finish up by observing that Dialogue Piece was originally published in the final July 1969 issue of Vito Conci and Bernadette Mayer's little magazine 0 to 9, Emilio Jacob has addressed elsewhere in his writing. This led me, in light of some of my own current research interests, and indeed a previous panel discussion with Jacob, to wonder about whether the registers of language employed within conceptual art and conceptualism also included literary language, albeit of the vanguard and experimental sort. Jeff Wall has famously claimed that conceptual art's substitution of the work by a text could only concern itself with its own validity, since if it attempted to say anything else, it would, in his terms, become literature. That's literature in Greenberg's negatively invested sense of the term, and thus, Wall goes on, post-conceptual. Yet I think if we make an examination of 0 to 9, we see the kind of complex and mutually determining relations that were at stake between poetry and artistic practice at the very moment of conceptual art's inception. Consequently, it seems necessary to interrogate the contention that conceptual art involved a proscription of the literary in any categorical sense. Here, I suggest conceptual art's emergence against the backdrop of the fluxus-inflected intermedial fusion of the arts needs more careful, critical attention. And on that note, I'm going to conclude my response and hand back to Joe for our roundtable. Thank you.